Chapter 35. Starrcade. During the summer of 1983, Dory, Ernie, Wahoo, and I started our build for the first ever Starrcade, to be held at the Greensboro Coliseum on Thanksgiving night of 1983. The name came from Dusty Rhodes, who was booking Florida at the time, but the concept was all Jimmy Crockett's. Officially, I was the booker in charge for the first Starrcade, not only because I was responsible for North Carolina, but because Dory Funk wasn't going to be there that night. He would be in Japan for the annual All-Japan Tag Team Tournament teaming with Giant Baba. I had a lot of experience in booking and building to big shows like Wrestling Star Wars, and since Ric Flair had come in for those cards, he apparently went back to the Carolinas and told Jimmy Crockett about the great job I was doing in Texas. That's why Jimmy made me responsible for North Carolina, because he knew that Starrcade would be there, and he wanted me to oversee it. At that time I was a very successful guy in the business, and my track record made that obvious. Even though I was very low-key about it, and didn't trumpet my successes all that much, the people that would know knew, and Jimmy Crockett and Dory Funk definitely knew I could build to and layer a big show. I was always very good at that, seeing where I'm going, figuring out how to get there, and most importantly, delivering the goods. Another reason Jimmy wanted me to book for him leading up to Starrcade was because I had a lot of good talent connections. Certain promoters, such as Sam Mushnick, Eddie Graham, and Vince McMahon, had good connections, but most promoters just stayed in one place, and that's why they needed bookers. A booker's number one responsibility was, above all else, to supply quality talent to an area. I was fortunate to have a lot of connections, because throughout my career, I was always out and about, and I saw talent from Australia, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. Of course, I was also very fortunate in that I booked some fantastic territories. Had I been a booker in Los Angeles, Portland, Vancouver, Kansas City, or Tennessee, I wouldn't have gotten to know a lot of good wrestlers. Therefore, a good booker had to be very selective of not only the talent he hired, but also of the jobs he took. The Sheik asked me several times to book for him in Detroit, and Don Owen talked to me many times about coming into Portland, as well, but I never gave it any thought. Given the facts that I was currently booking in a great territory, and I had built up a solid crew of guys I regularly used over the years, I ended up bringing a lot of my guys in for Starrcade. If you look at the lineup, you'll realize just how much input I had on Starrcade simply based on how many of my guys were there, because I used to have a saying, "You're figured in." When I told someone that, it meant that for every big show that I produced, they would be in a prominent spot to make a good payoff. And sure enough, for Starrcade, I made sure that Mark Lewin, Dick Slater, Bob Orton, the Great Kabuki, and Abdullah the Butcher, my boys, were all figured in. We loaded the card from top to bottom, and that really made the difference. Yes, Starrcade was promoted really well, but it had a lot to do with the talent that was there. You can never build a strong fortress out of weak material. You have to have strong personalities and great in-ring performers, and I was very fortunate to be blessed with an abundance of both. Starrcade was also unique because every match had meaning, and had been programmed for that very show. There wasn't one excuse me match on the card, it was all balls to the wall action, and the crowd was into every single match that night. There was a lot of meat there, and that was a big part of its success. Starrcade even had its own special music, by Frank Stallone, Believe It or Not, which in itself made the show seem like an event. Also, we broadcasted the show live via closed circuit not only throughout the Carolinas, but in other places like Georgia, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, and the Virgin Islands, to name just a few. That was extremely groundbreaking and risky, because even though wrestling promoters had utilized closed circuit in the past, never before had they attempted doing it outside of their own territory. On Thanksgiving night, people came from all throughout the Carolinas for the show, and many people traveled great distances hoping to buy a ticket at the last minute. Unfortunately for them, the building was packed, and there were helicopters flying over announcing to the overflow crowd, "This event is sold out." I'm very proud of the first Starrcade, and because it is so historical and still talked about and celebrated to this day, I'll briefly go through each match one by one. Mark Lewin and Kevin Sullivan versus Johnny Weaver and Scott McGee. Mark and Kevin were in Florida at the time, but I brought them up for Starrcade. Mark and I will always have a very strong bond, and I was thrilled to get him booked on the show. At the time, Kevin was doing a devil-worshipping gimmick in Florida, and Mark was his sidekick, billing himself as the drugged-out Purple Haze. Kevin's gimmick was really based on something that rocker Alice Cooper had done in the 70s, but Kevin was always bizarre. If he could have held a doll in his arms on TV and said it was a baby, he would have cut its head off just to get heat. That was Kevin's way of presenting himself, and while it fit Kevin, I didn't like it when Mark presented himself in a drug-induced light, and preferred when he was Maniac Mark Lewin. Mark's Maniac persona was based on the premise that in the late 60s, He was a mercenary soldier in Southeast Asia, and on one of his missions he was left behind. In order to survive, he had to eat frogs and lick the dew off of lily pads. I didn't manage them that night, because I felt uncomfortable presenting myself in an alliance with a devil worshipper and a drugged-out weirdo. I always tried to maintain some class with the way I conducted myself and the people I presented. Then again, I presented Abdullah the Butcher. Bugsy McGraw and Rufus R. Jones versus the Assassins. I had used Bugsy prominently in Texas and really helped him develop his character, much to Fritz's chagrin, and always enjoyed working with him. Paul Jones managed the Assassins, who were Jody Hamilton and Hercules Hernandez, before he went to the WWF and got his big break. The Great Kabuki versus Jimmy Valiant. I love Jimmy. He's a Chicago boy, and I had known him for years before our run in the Carolinas. He was a fabulous entertainer, and when he would hit the ring, the crowd would go crazy. That night, his match with the Great Kabuki was pandemonium from beginning to end. Dick Slater and Bob Orton versus Wahoo McDaniel and Mark Youngblood. I had to bring my boys Dick and Bob in. I had originally put them together and been their manager in 1975, so it was only fitting I got them booked on Starrcade. I understand there is a rumor that Hulk Hogan was originally scheduled to be Wahoo's partner for this match, but I can tell you without a doubt that Hulk Hogan was never scheduled for Starrcade. I don't care what Bill Apter promoted in his magazine, or if Hogan's picture was in the program that night, along with other wrestlers who didn't appear on the show. By the way, it was never on the books. Believe me, I would know. Abdullah the Butcher versus Carlos Colon. We took a match that was traditionally seen in the Caribbean, and put it in, of all places, Greensboro, North Carolina. That made Carlos look like a superstar in Puerto Rico, because he was on the biggest North American show of the year with his most hated opponent, and it showed that the match was important outside of the Caribbean, and was valued worldwide. It helped Carlos a great deal, but at the same time it brought his promotion, the World Wrestling Council, to Starrcade, so it made Starrcade seem bigger, as well. It was win-win for everyone. Greg Valentine versus Roddy Piper. Greg, the son of my good friend Johnny Valentine, was involved in a real hot feud with my buddy from Georgia, Roddy Piper. That was a long time build, and their dog collar match was so brutal that Roddy lost some hearing that night, but it was accidental. They were actually best of friends, and went out after the match and partied together. Both Greg and Roddy left shortly after Starrcade to work for the WWF. Jack and Jerry Briscoe versus Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood. The Briscoes were excellent heels. They did very little cheating, and they wouldn't do anything illegal behind the referee's back, but they would take every legal advantage that they could take, which made them the aggressors. Jack was a legendary figure by that time, and Jerry was quite good on the microphone. He had always been a babyface, but when he got to be a heel, he used everything he ever heard any heel say. Ric Flair versus Harley Race. No one was happier than I was when Rick won the belt that night, and Harley was ready to drop it. In those days, the champion had to regularly go to Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky, Los Angeles, Portland, Japan, St. Louis, Oklahoma, the Carolinas, Texas, Florida, and Georgia, among many other territories. He had to go out every night and give his best performance for 45 minutes to an hour, because that's what the promoters wanted. In some areas they went to there were great competitors and contenders, and in some areas there was subpar talent who couldn't put their jock straps on with directions. It's a very difficult schedule, so anytime a champ dropped the belt, he was ready. Former NWA champion Gene Kiniski was the referee for this match, by the way. Starrcade was a huge success, and it showed in the payoffs. The Great Kabuki and I got $10,000 each. When Jimmy Crockett handed me the $20,000, he asked in his own little way, "Is this okay?" I assured him that it was more than okay. Jimmy Crockett was very generous to all involved that night, and even paid the guys who took the tape of Rick winning the title to all of his TV stations $500 apiece. Little did I know at the time that Starrcade wouldn't be the only show I had a hand in booking that night. Fritz von Erich promoted a big Thanksgiving night show of his own at the Reunion Arena in Dallas, and, believe it or not, actually reused one of my finishes. He booked Kerry Von Erich versus Michael Hayes in a steel cage, and personally slammed the cage door on Michael's head for some payback time. I guess Fritz didn't want me to be his booker, but he sure wanted my finishes. Not only did Starrcade have a tremendous impact on the fans, but on the wrestling business, as well. Everyone in the industry sat up and took notice of what we were doing in Charlotte that night. No matter what anyone says about other wrestling supercards, Starrcade truly is the granddaddy of them all. In many ways, that's why Starrcade lasted as an annual event until the year 2000, because it was more than just a big show. In years to come, people would start buying tickets for Starrcade without even knowing the card, because they knew it was going to be a big spectacular, and that it was the cream of the crop. Starrcade was a great achievement for me. I'm proud to have had a hand in booking the first one, and it's a testament to its success that Starrcade became an annual event for years to come.